Proceeding will start shortly. The 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 proceeding will start shortly.
Order. Elliot Colburn to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 600966 related to the Approved Mileage Allowance Payment rate, or AMAP. The prayer of this petition reads, and I quote, "The HMRC mileage rate for reimbursing the use of private cars, e.g. for employees but also volunteers, has been fixed at 45 pence a mile up to 10,000 miles since 2011. The lack of any increase since then is a serious disincentive to volunteer drivers, particularly as fuel has gone up again recently. Since 2011, inflation has gone up by over 25%. Fuel has increased by over 20% over the last 5 years. Volunteer car drivers who did so much during COVID and still do to get people to their healthcare settings, for example, hospitals, vaccination centres, and to deliver shopping and prescriptions, are not being compensated fairly for the use of their cars. Consequently, charities are struggling to recruit new volunteer drivers. These drivers help free up hospital beds and keep people independent and in their own homes." I will gladly give way.
Thank you so much for making such a powerful opening to his speech. Does he agree with me that the approved mileage allowance payments must increase, and they must increase because they haven't increased since 2011, motoring costs have increased, cost of fuel has increased, and vehicle maintenance costs have also increased?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for that intervention, and she's basically just nicked the crux of my speech, but I thank her for making it so succinctly for me. The petition received over 41,500 signatures, including 25 from Carshalton and Wallington. And I should declare, Mr Sharma, on behalf of all parliamentarians, that MPs' mileage rates claimed through IPSA are also done along the HMRC 45 pence a mile route. But I hasten to add, we are not debating MPs' rates here today. As such, I would also like to thank all those who signed the petition and have taken an interest in today's debate, including the many volunteer and community groups that have been in touch. I would also like to thank the petition creator, the Reverend Nick Ralph, as well as representatives from the Good Neighbour Network Group, the Community Transport Association, Unison, and the Association of Taxation Technicians for meeting with me to discuss this debate. And as always, a massive thanks must go to the Petitions Committee team who have worked incredibly hard to organise these meetings I've just mentioned and to provide briefings in advance of today's debate. Now, Mr Sharma, when I agreed to lead today's debate, I did so with the charity focus of this petition's original prayer, remembering the enormous volunteering effort I've witnessed and was part of during the pandemic, both locally and nationally. Because our country does have a proud history of volunteering. One route can be traced back even to the medieval age, where there was a strong link between religion and the aiding of the sick, needy and poor. Indeed, according to sources in England, there were over 500 voluntary hospitals established in England in the 12th and 13th centuries alone. And more recently, within this century, and for us as London MPs at least, we think of that enormous army of volunteers that helped to spread joy and cheer throughout the Olympic Park in the 2012 London Olympics. And then, of course, as I've already noted, the hundreds of thousands of people who volunteered their time to help those in need during the COVID pandemic. From taking part in befriending telephone calls to collecting and dropping off shopping or prescriptions, the effort was absolutely enormous. And it was, Mr Sharma, one that made me incredibly proud of our country and indeed my own community. And volunteering is, of course, an incredibly noble calling. And this is endorsed by the long history of royal patronage that we have seen. Even just this year, with the Coronation Champion Awards launched with the Royal Voluntary Service to recognise volunteers who'd gone above and beyond for their charities. And volunteering was also made an intrinsic part of their Majesty's coronation itself, billed as a lasting legacy of the momentous occasion. The big help out took place on the Bank Holiday Monday of the celebration, with hundreds of thousands taking part across the country. And the numbers speak for themselves when it comes to volunteering. According to surveys taken in 2019-20, 64% of people said they had volunteered at least once in that year, with just shy of 40% saying that they had volunteered in the past year alone. And in the following year, 62% of respondents stated that they'd volunteered at least once in the last year, with that number reporting to have volunteered in the last month, rising to 41%. Now, this potted history of the relationship between our country, its people, and volunteering features so heavily in my introduction, Mr Sharma, because it helps to set the scene and indeed the importance of this petition. Many in our own communities depend on volunteers. However, it's important that those volunteers, whatever it is they may be doing, feel valued and feel appreciated. It's not just important for retaining volunteers, but for recruiting new ones too. Yet from the conversations that I've had with the affected stakeholders, the current HMRC Approved Mileage Allowance Payment, or AMAP rate, is proving to be a real sticking point for many charities in retaining their volunteers, particularly ones who are longer serving. I would gladly give way.
Powerfully outlining the benefits to the community of volunteering, but he'll also be aware of the benefits to individuals. Does he share my concern that as the costs of motoring rise, we're excluding many people from the benefits to them and their community of volunteering, and that all of those networks of community transport should be consulted in any review of this mileage rate?
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for that intervention, and I absolutely agree with her. Just to give some background, Mr Sharma, to what the mileage allowance payment rate actually is. This currently allows for volunteers to claim up to 45 pence a mile for the first 10,000 miles, and then a subsequent 25 pence for each mile after that. Yet this rate of 45 pence hasn't been reviewed or increased since 2011. However, it's not just charities that are affected by this, but many employees too, from a variety of businesses, who also use the AMAP rates when regulating employees using their private cars for their business. The government, in its initial response to this petition, stated that the rate is intended to create an administrative simplicity by using an average which reflects vehicle running costs including fuel, depreciation, servicing, insurance and vehicle exercise duty. And indeed, many of the stakeholders that I spoke to agreed that the rate was probably the best suited approach for reimbursing volunteers and employees. It is easy to use, free from bureaucracy, and minimises the burden of any extra paperwork or the potential for inaccurate or incorrect payments. But the issue at hand, Mr. Sharma, for petition creator, is not necessarily the system itself, but rather the rate that it is paid at. The RAC's 2011 Cost of Motoring Index summed up that year as one that was not an easy one for motorists. Drivers had to contend with record high fuel prices and a sharp increase in the cost of car insurance. Much of this remains true today, just a lot more expensive. The disparity between today and when the AMAP was adjusted last is demonstrated most simply around the cost of fuel, despite all costs around vehicle use increasing. According to figures, the current average nationwide cost of petrol is 144.86p a litre, with diesel at 145.5p. Yet, if we were to go back to 2011, the last time the rates were changed, petrol averaged 133.65p a litre and diesel at 138.94. What I will note, Mr. Sharma, is that what these averages don't consider are sporadic fluctuations in the costs over that time. One argument that has been made and noted in the government's response is that fuel costs were brought down, but with a temporary 12-month cut to petrol and diesel of 5p a litre announced in last year's spring statement. And many that I spoke to in the run-up to this debate argued in favour not just of a review of the rate as it is, but regular reviews to the rate. This, I would argue, would then take into account these cost fluctuations and make it a much nimbler system in light of the continuing uncertainty around the general costs of running a vehicle, as well as specifically fuel prices. As such, charities and employers would be able to properly fund and support those who currently find the AMAP only partially covering the related costs of running a vehicle, without any fear of being penalised through the tax system for paying a more fitting rate. This is because the AMAP is only one suggested way of employers and charities to reimburse those drivers. Indeed, they could choose to pay more, some may argue, to be in line with the increased cost of running a vehicle. Yet if a higher allowance is paid, an income tax and national insurance charge is placed on the difference. And it's precisely because of this that the petition was set up, to try and scrap the subsequent charge for those wanting to pay an allowance that better mirrors the reality of driving a vehicle in 2023 rather than 2011. And on this, I would appreciate if the Minister could inform us how much revenue is actually collected through the overpayment of the AMAP rate, and how much this would be impacted if the rate was to be raised to, say, 60 pence as outlined in the petition. And it could be argued that if this was a more rigorous, up-to-date support, more up-to-date support system brought in with regular reviews, our businesses and charities would be able to ensure those using their vehicles for work and for volunteering are valued, and as such find it easier to retain them. Now, whilst the government's work in stabilising fuel costs, and as such the fuel duty cut in light of the knock-on effects of the invasion of Ukraine amongst other factors, I believe that stabilising work should rightly filter down through to our volunteers and workers through a regularly reviewed and increased AMAP rate. The arguments in favour of this petition, of the petition's aim, seem to be incredibly plausible, especially as I note, and I'm sure we will hear a lot throughout today's debate, that this has not been adjusted since 2011. Mr. Sharma, I hardly need to list the ways in which our world, our lives and the cost of things have changed over the course of the last 12 years. Instead, what I will do in drawing a conclusion to my remarks is to reiterate this debate's intentions to the workers and volunteers who have strived to get this country moving and growing over the course of the last decade, and I will gladly give way.
Thank you. It's a pleasure listening to him, and I think he makes incredibly important points. On the Isle of Wight, we have a very strong voluntary sector. And does he share my hope that the Minister is going to listen very carefully to these incredibly sensible remarks he makes? Mike Bulpett, one of our lead volunteers, on the island, runs a community action centre as chief executive there. He has contacted me because he's very worried that a lot of our voluntary drivers are going to find it difficult to continue to volunteer because of the lack of not only a rise but also the regular review. So on his behalf, we thoroughly support what he's saying, and would he share my hope that the Minister will be listening and feeling generous today? Thank you.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for that intervention, and he's absolutely right. I think it comes back to the core principle that volunteers in particular, as I know that this rate affects businesses and employees as well, but volunteers in particular who are doing such a noble service and giving up their free time to help others should not be penalised for doing so. But it's quite clear that this current rate is affecting the ability to recruit volunteers to use their private vehicles when they are so needed. And I'll gladly give way again. Yeah.
Being so gracious and giving way again. But would he agree with me that both volunteers need to be appreciated, and this is one way in which they're being appreciated by actually making sure these allowances increase? But in the past, I myself was a public sector worker, and public sector workers did so much during the COVID period and continue to do so, and they also should be given the finance which is due them.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and of course she is also absolutely right. Public sector workers, particularly those working in our National Health Service, for example, are also impacted by this reduced rate, and I think that only enhances the call of the petition today to increase and review that rate more regularly. I just want to end, Mr Sharma, by saying that our volunteers in particular, but also our public sector workers, have shown themselves to be some of the true engines of growth and betterment, and it's surely time that they feel properly supported in their endeavours, whether they be entrepreneurial or charitable. And if we are to ensure a brighter future for our country, those who drive it must be given a rate that mirrors today's world and not one of over a decade ago. And as such, I look forward to hearing from all honourable and right honourable members today, and I do hope that the government will listen to these calls, look to introducing an increased rate, but also a system which more regularly reviews this so that we're not having to come back to this every 10 years or so and just hope the government fancies doing it one day. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 600966 relating to the approved mileage allowance payment rate. Can he make us here?
Thank you very much, Mr Sharma. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I pay tribute to the member for bringing this, and indeed not simply the eloquence with which he's put forward the argument, but the very balanced nature. I think it wasn't simply the tenor in which he used, but the fact that this does unite the chamber, that there is almost a manifest injustice here. There is little that has not increased since 2011, and indeed in terms of political, there's been a significant number of elections, never mind changes in office. And it's obviously, as the member correctly pointed out, not simply the voluntary sector, but it goes into those who are employed, not simply those who are employed by the council, but those indeed who are self-employed, because the traditional white van man, but indeed in other occupations, also requires to seek some recompense for the mileage that they're required to do to be able to carry out their trade, their services, or whatever. It is a matter I've been pursuing locally. I know it has often been put forward that there can be local settlements, but as the member quite correctly pointed out, the template tends to be HMRC. There are implications in terms of taxation if you don't do it. And indeed, even whilst I've had negotiations and discussions with officials, it's very difficult to get political sign-off, so it's one thing for officials to be persuaded. There are members here, I know, who were at the meeting held by Unison along with the RAC Foundation. Now, there may be some on some side of the chamber who would view Unison as having a particular vested interest. I don't think that can be said about the RAC Foundation. They are an organisation established for a particular... By all means.
I too was at the Unison organised meeting, and I can only say positive things about the engagement that they've had with members right across the House. And if I could just put on the record my thanks to Anna Burley from Unison for the report that she so ably prepared in respect of this.
Oh, absolutely. I'm sitting with a copy of the report myself, and the member's quite correct. There were people from a variety of parties there. And as I say, the RAC Foundation is not there in a political capacity. It went there, it looked at it. I think Unison did the right thing in doing it in conjunction with them. It gives it ballast, it gives it legitimacy, because the RAC, along with the AAR, specialists in motoring matters, and they have come to the conclusion that clearly 63p, together with some form of system, is in fact it's necessary. On a local basis, I face all the difficulties that the member moving the motion very ably has also pointed out. East Lothian isn't the biggest constituency. It's not the size of some of those in the Highlands of Scotland. But it's still significant, running along the length of the A1 from Musselburgh all the way to the villages before you hit the Scottish borders. That's in excess of 60 miles. Although the principal town tends to be Haddington, the community hospital is hubbed there, the council is based there, you're unable to work without going into the other towns that are equally jealous of their own independence, seek to retain their own facilities, whether it's those on the coast such as Dunbar, where I live, or North Berwick, or inland with Tranent or elsewhere, never mind the small villages. So whether you're doing voluntary work, whether you're working for the council, whether you're carrying out a trade, you cannot carry out your job without running up a significant mileage. And it's not simply those doing jobs such as care. I know those who are at senior positions and health visitors who are actually struggling financially because, as with others, they've seen their mortgage go up, they're having to keep the roof above their head, and yet it's costing them to work because the daily mileage rate that they carry out is not being recompensed. They're having to have a car not simply to carry out their job, but they're thereafter having to pay additional costs simply to carry out their job on behalf of their employer. So that's why, as I say, I think this has to be taken on board. And the member, quite correctly in moving it, pointed out that we shouldn't just seek to remedy it once and then have to look at it year after. It would be worthwhile to enter into a position where this could be index linked. But we also have to bear in mind, and the member who was in attendance will also be aware, that that was made quite clear by workers, because it's not simply the cost of fuel, and the 145 resonates with what ASDA's currently charging in Dunbar. But let's remember that when this is paid by employers, it's also meant to be recompensing you for the wear and tear upon your car. It's also meant to be recompensing you for the insurance. And I thought one of the most significant things in the RAC Foundation was that actually fuel costs had increased at the lowest rate. Insurance, as I remember, had increased at the highest rate, but the other factors had also increased. So it's not simply that you're having to pay for your fuel, whether it's petrol or diesel, you're actually having to pay the car costs that are necessary for your work and that your employer expects you, because you cannot do that job, certainly in my location, but it's the same whether it's urban or rural. So it's for that reason that we require to have this amendment. There is, as I say, I think, political buy-in across the chamber. There is a recognition, not just simply from trade unions, but from motoring organisations, that this is long past its sell-die date. It's quite clear from what others have said that it's not simply people are struggling to be able to do their work, and we're required to get people into the labour market, as there's statements being made elsewhere in this building on that very subject. People have to be able to be recompensed for their work, not be paying out their own pocket to do their job, and we require, by all means.
Making a brilliant and eloquent speech about this issue, which affects one of my constituents, and many of my Livingston constituents have signed the petition, but one of my constituents, who's a housing officer, was struggling to get by before the cost of living crisis on the mileage allowance. And does he share my concerns that whether it's NHS staff, public sector staff, if they can't get by on the mileage rate that's being offered, they will go elsewhere, and we are already struggling to keep people in those vital roles?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the issue was first raised with me by the Chief Executive of East Lothian Council because they're struggling to retain staff, and staff are necessary. So I'll simply finish up there, Mr Chair. It does seem to me that we have buy-in across the chamber. We have buy-in, I think, in the community, as shown by Unison and the RAC Foundation. This is something about remedying a wrong. 2011 is long time ago politically, never mind in terms of costs. And on that basis, I do hope that the Minister can come round to addressing not simply the rate, but indeed let's make sure that we don't have this continuing on a yearly basis and that we sort out some annualised system.
Peter Aldous, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Pleasure to serve with you in the chair, and I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Carshalton and Wallington, for leading this e-petition debate. Petition number 600-966 calls for a review of the approved mileage allowance payment rate, that's the AMAP rate, which has remained at the same level as we've heard since 2012. The petitioners are supported in their campaign by the Community Transport Association, as well as my honourable friend, the member for Harrow East, who has previously called for an urgent review so as to reflect the soaring cost of living increases. Mr Sharma, when in the past campaigns have been launched calling for a review of the AMAP rate, the government have invariably responded by stating that the rate is not mandatory, that employers can set whatever level of mileage reimbursement they want. However, very few do, due to the tax liability implications for employers and volunteers. The rate is thus a standard to which the vast majority of businesses and charities adhere. It is regarded as best practice, and it avoids the complications of drivers having to pay income tax. I acknowledge that the 5p per litre cut to petrol and diesel prices announced in the spring statement of 2022 and extended through to next year has provided respite and support to drivers, but the current cost of living crisis has brought into clear focus the need for a review, and if it is not carried out, my fear is that there will be negative knock-on implications to other services such as the NHS, social care and public transport, and ultimately the Treasury will end up picking up the bill. Many of my concerns revolve around community transport and the great work which is carried out in North East Suffolk and South East Norfolk by BACT, who provide community transport for those who for other forms of public transport are not easily available. They have their own minibuses and wheelchair-accessible vehicles, but a significant proportion of their services are provided by their volunteer drivers using their own vehicles. The failure to review the AMAP rate is imperiling the crucial lifeline service that BACT and many other community transport providers carry out and provide. Mr Sharma, I shall briefly set out what I believe is the compelling case for a review. First of all, it should be pointed out that the cost of motoring has increased significantly since 2011-2012. The petition, as we have heard, highlights that inflation has increased by over 25% since 2011 and fuel by over 20% over the past 5 years. Since 2011, vehicle maintenance costs have risen by 38%, and as we've heard, the RAC Cost of Transports Index has increased by 41%. The third sector, that is the voluntary sector, play a vitally important role in local communities. We would not have got through COVID without these volunteers, and we need them even more now so as to get through the cost of living crisis. Many of them, working for charities and organisations like BACT, use their cars, and it is only right that they are fairly recompensed for doing so. Currently, Mr Sharma, they are not, and this is disincentivising volunteers from offering their services. Community transport operators, such as BACT, are increasingly reporting challenges in driver recruitment and retention. In many areas, including Suffolk and Norfolk, community transport operators have become a vitally important component part of the public transport system. They are, in effect, the Heineken of that system. They go where commercial operators and the local transport authority either can't or won't go. Heavy reliance has been placed on them to provide this service. Without their drivers, a system that is already operating, I sense, on the brink, will collapse altogether, and many vulnerable people will be left very isolated. Community transport operators such as BACT provide a vital service to the NHS, driving people to hospital, to GPs' surgeries, to vaccination centres, and also to dentists. The latter can be quite a long trek, and that assumes that an NHS dentist can be found. They also provide non-emergency transport to hospitals. If they are not around to do this, this is another cost that the NHS will have to bear at a time that it can ill afford to do so. Mr. Sharma, a product of COVID is the dramatic increase in social isolation and loneliness. During the lockdowns, many vulnerable people were left marooned in their own homes. Invariably, almost always the case, local volunteers rallied round to ensure that they were not alone and they were not forgotten. Post-lockdown, many people have only tentatively come out of their own homes. For some, the only lifeline that they now have to the outside world is provided by those volunteers who drive them for their weekly shop. Without them, life would be very lonely. Mr. Sharma, it's also important to acknowledge that the service provided by community transport operators such as BACT is vitally important in rural areas, where, for many people, there is invariably no alternative means of public transport. If the volunteer drivers throw in the towel because they are not being properly recompensed, then another group of people will be left stranded, unable to access services that so many of us take for granted. Finally, Mr. Sharma, I come on to social care. The government quite rightly recognised the importance and the need for an integrated and improved health and social care system, which involves keeping people independent in their own homes. This needs a whole army of dedicated social care workers on the road, invariably in their own vehicles, visiting and supporting their clients. Unfortunately, they are not well paid, and the last thing that they need is a mileage allowance which does not cover the cost of keeping what is invariably an old vehicle roadworthy and on the road. Skip and save on the AMAP rate will result in recruitment becoming even more difficult in this vitally important sector. Mr. Sharma, in conclusion, there is a compelling case for a fair, urgent and transparent review of the rate. I look forward to my honourable friend the Minister's reply, but I would urge him to take the message back to my right honourable friend the Chancellor of the Exchequer to instigate the review straight away with a view to announcing the outcome in the spring budget. Thank you, Mr. Sharma.
Jack Brereton.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma. It's a pleasure to speak with you in the chair, and I commend my honourable friend for Carshalton and Wallington in actually leading this debate. I think he did an excellent job in his speech. I am very happy to contribute to this important debate, and although at 38 the number of my constituents who've actually signed this petition is relatively small, the issue of mileage allowance payments does loom large in my constituency and certainly has been raised on a number of occasions in correspondence and conversations that I've had with constituents in Stoke-on-Trent South. Stoke-on-Trent is a hub for logistical industries and delivery operations of various kinds, actually, and there is also a larger than average proportion of the workforce in health and personal care services. As we've just heard, social care particularly is impacted by this, with the number of people going out to care for people in people's homes, driving in often their own vehicles to undertake that care. Stoke-on-Trent is a city where there is no tube or tram network and very limited local train network. Bus services have been in sorry decline for too long, and while I'm glad to say that this government has shown real commitment to remedying that, the fact that at the moment there is very often no alternative to the use of private vehicles for work purposes amongst those who have to travel beyond the usual commute without a company car or other such vehicle to work. In 2011, it was recognised that at the time had come for the main allowance to increase by 5p to 45p, because it had been held at 40p for nearly 10 years since 2002. It has now been more than 10 years since that last uprating. At the very least, we need to look at those allowances again and undertake a review, as many of my colleagues have called for here today. I do, of course, accept that the last 10 years have been somewhat different to the 10 years before them. The decade up to 2011, fuel duties rose from 45.82 pence per litre to 58.95 pence per litre. But as many colleagues here today have alluded to, there are a number of other costs that are incurred by drivers. But in the decade subsequent to 2011, of course, the story has been very different in terms of fuel duty, thanks to this Conservative government. Duty was frozen, first cut, to 57.95 pence per litre in March 2011, and then frozen for a decade until a cut of 5p per litre on the 23rd of March last year, which we still enjoy, thankfully, today. I, of course, welcome the actions that the government have taken on that. It is of benefit to all motorists, and it is the simplest administrative measure available. And generally, I do support the Lawson doctrine of lower tax rates funded by fewer tax breaks where possible. But there is clearly a need for a specific tax break of mileage allowance in order to reflect the additional inflationary costs and many other costs of using personal vehicles for work purposes. The system needs to be fit for purpose, and the rates within the system need to be appropriate to the current situation. The government itself says it wants to minimise administrative burdens, and so the system needs to be simple and predictable. I do wonder if the employer's discretion on using the AMAP rates does in fact really make it that predictable for the driver at least. I know there is huge variability actually in how the rate is applied, with many being far less generous than the standard rate. And I've heard of a number of employers who unfortunately are not currently even applying the 45p rate, never mind an even higher rate. And some workers are having to suffer much lower rates than that. Many who do larger amounts of mileage as well, such as those who work in delivery or trade which requires them to travel around the country, have been hit by the 10,000 mile advisory annual limit, after which the rate drops from 45p to 25p. And I've spoken with a number of my constituents in Stoke-on-Trent South who do undertake trades which require them to travel up and down the country to undertake work, to deliver some of the services that they provide, who are doing often many more than 10,000 miles in a year, which means that they are having to put up with a much lower rate after they've gone over that 10,000 mile limit. I do also notice that the startups.co.uk website advise and warns budding entrepreneurs and contractors that whether you can claim and how much depends on an assortment of factors that can require a lot of admin to calculate. Notwithstanding that, I think most colleagues would agree that the current system has not been as much of a pressing issue historically. The petitions and letters campaign have appeared quite recently, and this is because the allowance rate is now felt acutely to be insufficient. And particularly this is due to the inflationary pressures that have been caused as we've come out of the pandemic, and also, of course, Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine, which has massively put up those inflationary pressures. Even in the face of the freeze and cut in fuel duty, this continues to be a major challenge. And in order to afford and therefore get a more generous allowance rate, there have been some suggestions to change the system so that only certain sectors qualify for a higher rate. So, as we were talking about social care, healthcare sectors, as a number of colleagues have mentioned today, particularly the voluntary sector, where many people who do voluntary work, who do take parcels and things from and volunteer their time, undertake that time using their own personal vehicles. And so it is important potentially to have a higher rate for those individuals who are volunteering and are struggling to, and those organisations who are currently now struggling to recruit volunteers because the rate remains at the 45p that it has been for so long. The government could certainly apply sectoral codes that it does with other reliefs, like the Energy Bill Relief Scheme, but deciding who it leads out can lead to quite challenging outcomes, as indeed I found it does with the Energy and Trade Intensive Industries Scheme, where some sectors who fall between the cracks have been left out. I don't underestimate how challenging the financial and fiscal situation is, and we do know that the costs of increasing the allowance by just 5p when it was done over 10 years ago was around £35 million per annum. So that is quite a significant cost. But as the Treasury prepares for the autumn statement, now just weeks away, and for the budget in the spring, it really does need to look at how the rates might be modernised to help with the cost of living pressures that many of our constituents are facing, given the fact that this rate has been frozen for so long. So I do hope that the Government and the Minister will take and consider this issue and look into the potential of having a review, and I look forward to what the Government's response will be in due course.
Peter Gibson.
Thank you, Mr Sharma. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I want to begin by congratulating my honourable friend for ably leading yet another petitions debate today. Mr Sharma, 38 of my constituents in Darlington have signed this petition, but I know that it is an issue of great importance to many more. Mileage rates were first introduced to reflect the costs of using a vehicle for work and to making them reimbursing them administratively straightforward. However, HMRC's current rates have not changed, as we have heard, since 2011, despite many increases in the cost of motoring, particularly the rapid increase in fuel prices which began in early 2022 as a result of Putin's illegal war in Ukraine. It is estimated that 1 in 5 frontline public service workers are required to drive to do their job, often driving significant distances in order to carry out their work. Moreover, research from the RAC Foundation shows that the typical vehicle of a public sector worker who drives for their job is older than average and driven further on average too. Bearing in mind that this will result in a greater effect on the servicing and depreciation of their vehicle, it is clear a significant number of these workers are going to be left out of pocket by the present mileage allowance payment rate. Now, Mr Sharma, I welcome that the mileage allowance rate of NHS workers under the Agenda for Change agreements are reviewed twice a year, taking into account changes in motoring costs, and I know that the current NHS mileage approved payment rates were increased on the 1st of January 2023 to 59p per mile. That is above the HMRC approved amount. Whilst I know that the approved mileage allowance payment rate is advisory, it is ultimately up for employers to choose what they reimburse. It is still hugely important to other public sector workers, charities and many others in society that mileage rates are reviewed across the board regularly and not just for those working in certain sectors. It would be remiss of me in this debate to not mention that many of my constituents face another issue when it comes to the cost of motoring as compared to others in the region. Fuel prices in Darlington's forecourts are significantly higher at Morrison's, Asda and Sainsbury's branches in Darlington when compared to those exact same supermarkets in Bishop Auckland. So I would ask the Minister if he can also look at what more can be done to ensure my constituents get a fair deal on fuel prices. I appreciate it's not a specific topic of this debate, but it does highlight the postcode lottery of forecourt fuel competition in this country. Mr Sharma, my honourable friend, the member for Rutland and Melton, was unfortunately unable to attend today's debate. However, she has, with your permission, asked me to raise her concerns on her behalf. Her constituency is made up of 187 villages, with a number of elderly residents who rely on incredible carers who will come to them by car. That's a similar issue to one that we face at Heriot Hospice in Harrogate, of which I'm a trustee. I know all too well about the impact of mileage rates on those who take part in rural community hospice care. I know that an increase from 45p to 60p per mile would be of significant benefit to people such as these carers, and I know that my honourable friend from Rutland also supports this increase in mileage rates too. Mr Sharma, I do appreciate the efforts that the government have taken to support motorists with increased costs. At the spring statement this year, the government announced a temporary 12-month cut to fuel duty of 5p per litre. Furthermore, to continue supporting motorists, it's extending the 5p fuel duty cut, which is worth £100 a year to the average driver. Ultimately, the government has to balance support for individuals with the responsible management of public finances, which fund our essential public services. But, Mr Sharma, it is clear to me, and it should be clear to the Minister, that mileage rates need to be looked at very closely. I do urge the Minister to do all that he can to ensure that we see this vital increase and that public sector workers who drive for work are not left out of pocket merely for doing their job. And the Minister should be mindful that the HMRC mileage rate is used as a benchmark for many charities, voluntary groups and small businesses too. And whilst it is up to these organisations to set their own rate, they do take a lead from HMRC. So in conclusion, public sector workers, charities, volunteers and small businesses do need to see a change in these rates. I trust that the Minister can see this has cross-party support, and reform would be very welcomed by people in every constituency. So please, let's level up these mileage rates.
Thank you. Adam Kasha.
Thank you, Mr Sharma. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Thank the Honourable Member for Carlston and Wallington for leading this petition, and other Honourable Members for their contributions. Since the start of this cost of living crisis, many of my Airdrie and Shotts constituents have been in contact with me to express their concerns over the need to raise the approved mileage allowance payment rate to help tackle the impact of rising fuel prices and maintenance costs. And as the member for Darlington mentioned, it's vital that we see reform and change. As the member for Stoke-on-Trent South has already highlighted, the AMAP has not changed in over a decade. And in fact, when AMAP was last updated in 2011, the rate was set at 45 pence. The petition suggests that this amount should be raised to 60 pence to help tackle rising fuel costs and the impact of inflation. Since the rate was last revised in 2011, costs have drastically increased, leaving much of the financial burden on drivers. It is now more expensive to run a personal vehicle in comparison to 2011. Although, Mr Sharma, fuel prices have decreased from their all-time high of nearly £2 a litre in July 2022, with prices now hovering around 143 pence per litre, this is still higher, around 16% higher than what the price was when the rate was set in 2011. The costs associated with the maintenance of a vehicle and insurance are also much higher and have risen by as much as 40% from 2011 until January 2023. These costs will continue to rise, leaving workers and volunteers worse off. The failure to raise mileage rates is particularly detrimental to those in the volunteer sector, and we've heard that from across the chamber today. I was recently contacted by Shots GBT. They're an organisation that aims to improve education, health and well-being for those living across Shots in the local area. One of the vital services they provide to the local community is transporting people, predominantly older people, to NHS appointments. Volunteers can cover thousands of miles in their vehicles, transporting people to get the treatment they require. They provide a vital service in support of the NHS and local authorities, and the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted just how integral they are to our society. It's only correct that those who volunteer are fairly compensated for the use of their cars. And I echo the calls from the Scottish Council of Voluntary Organisations and Volunteer Scotland that these rates should be risen to give better compensation to those who give back to society. As my good friend, the Honourable Member for East Lothian, said in his constituency, it's not geographically the largest. My constituency of Airdrie Shots is the same. It's not particularly large in comparison to some of my Scottish colleagues, but it does still encompass some rural areas. It's obvious that those that live in rural areas are more dependent on the vehicles to undertake their work. Some constituents have said to me that they have a sense of essentially they're subsidising their employer for their use of their car. Those in typically low-wage professions often travel the most for work. Some professionals, such as care professionals, drive many thousands of miles each year as part of their employment. By failing to adequately compensate them, it leaves many out of pocket, especially during a cost of living crisis. The problem is particularly acute, however, for Highland communities. And as my colleagues from these constituencies can attest, it is often many tens of thousands of miles that they're having to drive around per year. That means that those working in some of our most rural constituencies in Scotland are racking up larger mileage and being left out of pocket. Chair, the Honourable Member for Waveney made a crucial point when he drew upon the impact of the cost of living crisis. I would gently go one step further and argue that the impact of failing to raise mileage rates goes to a larger issue of mismanagement of the economy by this government. It's a failure to also recognise the impact of its actions on constituents across the four nations. The volatility in fuel prices at this point seems to become a regular feature of our lives. The announcement today, in fact, that fuel prices are 6 pence higher than what they should be due to weaker competition between supermarkets, is only the latest example of this. The lack of action from the UK government has allowed supermarkets to artificially increase prices. This 6 pence rise completely offsets the 5 pence fuel allowance introduced last year. Workers and volunteers, Chair, are relying on mileage rates. They're not only faced with the impact of volatile fuel prices, but also the government's inability to get a handle of inflation, with the UK having the worst rate in the G7. Despite the Prime Minister's promises to halve inflation, the UK looks to miss its target. Alongside inflation, household disposable income continues to fall. This year, it's estimated to decrease by 3.2%. This is on top of a 3.1% fall in the year prior. By failing to act on raising mileage rates at the last budget, the UK government is leaving employees and volunteers financially worse off. I hope that the Minister will lay out what steps the UK government is taking to raise mileage rates and address the concerns of those who have signed this petition. We clearly have buy-in from across the chamber. Minister, let's get this done.
Hear, hear.
Abina Apeng Asari.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Mr Sharma. And I want to thank everybody that has spoken in today's debate. I found all your insights informative, and you all spoke passionately about individuals and your constituencies, about areas that are important for millions of people up and down the country. I also want to say I'm grateful for the Honourable Member for Corsarton and Wallington for his contribution to this debate, which provided an overview of this issue. We are here today to discuss the petition signed by over 40,000 members of the public that asks the government to increase the HMRC mileage rate from 45p mile to 60p mile. Mr Sharma, approved mileage allowance payments are used by employers to reimburse employees' expenses for business mileage in their private vehicle. The government sets these rates. The AMAP rates aim to reflect running costs including fuel, servicing and depreciation. The Minister has previously stated that depreciation is estimated to constitute the most significant proportion of AMAP rates. Firstly, I want to say how essential it is that the HMRC mileage rate is for millions across the country. For those working hard for their families, businesses and communities, it is a vital measure to make sure they're not out of pocket for the extra miles they do in their private vehicles. And this has been reflected in conversations made by members today in this debate. And as a country, we are also proud of our volunteers who spend their spare time helping others and saving lives. The mileage rate is critical to support system to provide not only the reimbursement for the actions, but also an incentive to do more where and when you can, no matter your financial status. As the Honourable Member for Corsarton and Wallington highlighted earlier, it's important to feel valued. This was also echoed by my honourable friend for Lewisham East. However, we are all aware of the current cost of living crisis that British people are facing. And this comes after 13 years of a Tory government. And it's clear to see that families are struggling through no fault of themselves, but as a result of the policies of this government. In the last year, Britain has been rocked by the worst cost of living crisis in a generation, driven particularly by spiralling energy bills, which have fuelled inflation and thrown 3 million into fuel poverty in England and forced businesses to close. Mr Sharma, this country needs a government that can get a grip and show some leadership. We need a government that focuses on the things that really matter and provides some hope and optimism about the future. The reality is that the mileage rates have not changed in over a decade. To be exact, the approved mileage rate is set by the Treasury for cars has not changed since 2011-12. It stands at 45p for the first 10,000 miles and 25p for every additional mile in a tax year. As already mentioned by members, the cost of petrol and oil has rose by 45% just last year. In addition, overall motoring costs, including petrol, oil, vehicle and maintenance, have soared since 2011. And while fuel prices have settled somewhat since last year, this country is still burdened by a high rate of inflation, an inflation rate of 8.7%. Mr Sharma, this is higher than European nations, this is higher than America, and proves that the government has left our economy exposed. With higher interest rates, we are now facing a Tory mortgage bombshell for millions across the country. The government is failing across the spectrum, and Labour wants to make the changes that will help fix that energy security, creating good jobs across the country and making, doing and selling more in Britain. With these increases in motoring costs and the overall cost of living crisis, it is reasonable sorry, I'm not sure what happened. With these increases in motoring costs and the overall cost of living crisis, it is reasonable to ask the Minister what impact the current mileage rate is having on the living standards of those affected. I also want to share a separate survey by Unison last year that has been echoed by a number of members, and this highlights how staff in our NHS and those in the healthcare industry are deeply reliant on their own vehicles to do their jobs. As we all know, this means if they're not reimbursed, then our healthcare workers are out of pocket for the life-saving work they do on a day-by-day basis. These findings from Unison are based on 550 staff, and they show that the vast majority, which is 91%, of those who drive a car at work use their own vehicle. More than 2 in 5, which is 44%, of those that travel over 4,000 miles for work, including some who clock up more than 10,000. An overwhelming number of staff, which is about 90%, 95% of staff who drive for work, are required to do so because it's part of their contract. And more than a fifth, which is 24%, say they're unable to use public transport to do jobs, either because none is available or doesn't run at suitable times. And around 1 in 6, which is 18%, say they need to carry heavy or dangerous equipment when they drive for work. We all know, and we've all heard personal stories from those in our constituencies who are struggling to put food on the table, pay their bills, and keep their children warm over weekends and over the winter. Workers and volunteers across the country do work long and hard hours, and they do deserve a government that listens and make fair and practical decisions in response. Therefore, I'm just really urging the government to kind of get around the table, to listen to the issues affecting millions of drivers across the country. And I'd be grateful if the Minister could confirm if this is taking place or whether they'll be carrying out this work in due course. It also brings up another important issue, which is transport infrastructure across our country. I know personally how tough it is for families and communities who struggle with necessary transport infrastructure to get to work. In my constituency, we have a large community in Thamesmead who have no station, which makes it one of the only communities in Greater London left without public transport on the map. And I'm happy to say on a positive note that I'm pleased to see that TfL has submitted proposals for the DLR extension to Thamesmead. But we know that this is not an isolated problem across the country, that there are other parts that have seen a decline in our transportation system. It's one reason why I think so many people have signed this petition, and it shows that our local communities severely lack the real transport infrastructure that they need and deserve. And one thing I wanted to say is that Labour have committed to giving our communities control over their own destiny by unlocking the pride and potential purpose of our towns and cities and putting power directly in the hands of people, whether it's England, Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. We feel that the UK is the most centralised in Europe and the most geographically unequal largest country in the developed world. That is no coincidence that it's too much power is hoarded in Westminster, and that is holding our country back. I also wanted to say, where we have communities that rely on cars, there is no adequate public transportation, and it's clear that the government needs to listen to them and explain to those level support they're providing. I also want to thank everyone that signed the petition, and also to highlight, as mentioned by other members, those that signed that petition, they don't want to earn more money. They don't want to be greedy, but they just want to seek a system that is fairer for all. And so therefore, I've got some questions for the Minister about the issues that I've raised. Firstly, does he expect there to be any change in the mileage rate in the near future? Can he confirm what thresholds he and the Treasury are currently looking at when deciding how to set the mileage rates? The Minister has said that the current economic outlook is one of the factors that they consider when assessing mileage rates. Therefore, given the fact that things are really difficult for people at the moment, where they're continuing to failure, there's continuing failure to get bills down, and has this had an impact on the government's decision around mileage rates this year? I also want to thank the Minister for responding to this debate, but what is needed, which I'd like to echo, is for the Minister to get around the table with these working families and those representing all those affected and provide full answers to their questions and full explanation to this critical issue. And I'll finish here, Mr Sharma, say that the government is facing this issue and so many more because of their inability to deal with their failure and to manage our economy of the last 13 years. We do need urgent action to address the significant issues that many people are failing, and Labour does have a serious plan to get the economy growing, and I urge the Minister to reassure worried constituents today who may be looking at this, who have signed the petition, that the government is listening and is going to take action on this issue. Thank you, Chair.
Gareth Davis, the Minister.
Well, Mr Sharma, it's always a pleasure to see you in the chair, and it's a great honour to serve under your chairmanship today. It's been an incredibly important subject, and I'll do my best to address all of the many points that have been made in some fantastic speeches, and I congratulate my honourable friend in particular for bringing this on behalf of the Petitions Committee, and thank everybody who signed the petition. This government, right up to the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, is absolutely committed to supporting individuals and businesses with the rising cost of living, and this includes motoring expenses. Let me respond to the various points by first, though, setting out what AMAPs actually is, the rationale for its existence and how it works, and then I'll go on to talk more broadly about how this government is supporting people, because honourable members have quite rightly expressed this on behalf of a number of their constituents. So as we've heard in this very good debate, approved mileage allowance payments, or AMAPs, allow employees to receive tax-free reimbursement from their employer when using their own vehicle for business journeys. The rate for cars and vans is currently set at 45p per mile for the first 10,000 miles travelled annually, and then 25p thereafter. The AMAP and simplified expenses rates are designed as tax simplifications, as has been pointed out by my honourable friends. It's intended to make it easier for employers, employees and small businesses to record their mileage and calculate how much tax relief is actually due. Simplification is at the heart of this. It's a key objective of the overall tax system. And the government wants that tax system that we are overseeing to be as fair, simple, and to support growth wherever possible. The AMAP and simplified expense rates are a long-standing tax simplification measure, and it helps us to achieve that simplification objective. Rather than having to work out a business or employment proportion of all their individual motoring costs, these rates allow taxpayers to make a simple calculation based on their business mileage to work out how much tax relief is actually due. These rates, from the basis of one single calculation, can take the place of multiple calculations that would otherwise be required and would be quite administratively taxing. Of course, because these single rates are much simpler than an alternative calculation of actual expenses, there will always be a trade-off between accuracy and simplicity for motorists that use these rates. The rate may reflect the actual costs of motoring better for some than others, and we completely accept that. In some cases, it may mean that the rates provide slightly more relief than the actual cost would, and in other cases, it might mean that the rates provide slightly less relief than the actual costs would too. This will depend on factors like fuel efficiency, the car size, driving conditions, and the level of associated costs, such as insurance. Tax simplification is an ongoing priority for this government, and AMAPs, frankly, helps us to achieve that. But ultimately, the AMAP rate is not mandatory, as has been pointed out by several colleagues today. Employee and employer expenses are a matter for individual employers and voluntary organisations to determine. It's up to employers to determine the remuneration and expenses for their employees. Now, employees who receive less than AMAP's rate, and this was rightly raised by my honourable friend for Stoke on Trent South, those who do receive less than the AMAP rate from their employer can claim mileage allowance relief on the difference that HMRC provide. This reduces their tax that they can pay, and I would urge his constituents to look into that in more detail. Of course.
Thank you. I want to thank the Minister for giving way. As you mentioned, the allowance AMAP relief where individuals can actually claim to get the money back. Does the government have figures in terms of how many people are currently using that method of route to try and get some sort of relief? Because that would be helpful. Thank you.
Very grateful. Yes, it's a very reasonable question. I don't have the figures to hand, but I'm happy to provide that if we are able to source that data for the Honourable Lady. I would also point out that employees who are paid expenses above the AMAP rate may be taxed on the difference depending on the personal circumstances. For example, if they earn in excess of the personal allowance. Now, as my honourable friend and for Carshalton and Wallingham and my honourable friend for Waveney, but also several colleagues across the chamber have outlined, volunteers are an important part of our communities and perform incredibly important services to all of us, and it's right that they be highlighted and recognised in the debate today. And this government recognises the outstanding contribution that all of them make, and charities who employ them to our communities, including mine in Grantham and Stamford. But I should point out and provide some reassurance to honourable members and friends that unlike employees, volunteers can receive payments in excess of the AMAP rate and do not have to pay tax where they can provide evidence that they have not made a profit. So if they provide the receipts and provide evidence of their travel, they don't have to pay tax above the AMAP rate, unlike employees. This provides volunteers and voluntary organisations with additional flexibility, given how important they are. And they are important to this government. That's why the Chancellor, for example, set out at the spring budget an additional £100 support package for charities and community organisations in England. And this will be targeted at voluntary and community and social enterprise organisations at most risk at this very difficult time. We'll be setting out more criteria in terms of the eligibility in due course, but that's something that my honourable friends may wish to monitor carefully. My honourable friend for Carshalton and Wallingham, of course.
I thank Peter for giving way. That was an interesting point, and I just needed to sort of digest what he was saying. And I think what he was saying that voluntary groups, that volunteer drivers can claim extra tax relief, provided they can show that they are not making a profit. Has he got any figures to show how many are actually doing that? Because I would actually suggest that the system is so complicated that actually very few are taking it up. Far simpler to increase the rate.
Well, I think I'm grateful to my honourable friend. I think the point I would make to him is simply that volunteer organisations don't need to use AMAPs. So long as receipts and evidence of journeys are shown, that is all that is required, and volunteer organisations can set their own rate, and it can be literally any rate, so long as that evidence is shown. AMAPs is a simplified rate and does apply to employees, for example, private organisations and businesses. I just want to address this point about the review period and the regularity of reviews, because it was mentioned by a number of colleagues. It's a fair point, but I think I would just point out that AMAP is a tax relief in its very nature, as is MAR, mileage allowance relief, and it is convention that these are reviewed at fiscal events, and that is partly in line largely in line with most taxes that we have, but it's also important for the work that we do with the OBR so that they can score during the budget process, and that's why this is always reviewed. It is reviewed every fiscal event, and I can assure him of that, but it is right that it is done at fiscal events and not in between the fiscal event cycle. Now, a couple of people have mentioned about self-employed individuals, so let me just very quickly address that. Self-employed individuals can choose to use simplified motoring expenses, which allows them to deduct a fixed rate per mile against their self-employed profits. And these rates mirror the AMAP rates. Self-employed individuals don't have to use this rate. They can instead choose to deduct capital allowances and actual costs. However, it's not possible to switch between the two options with the same car or van once a self-employed individual has chosen to use either the simplified mileage rate or the capital allowances and expenses. And so I hope that clarifies the position. They do have that choice. Some honourable members have rightly talked about the cost of living situation that we find ourselves in, and I want to directly address that now, because AMAPs is one part of our system to support employees across the country, but it's important to recognise the other measures that this government is taking to support people at this very difficult time, and it is part of the review process when we're looking at AMAPs. So I would simply reiterate the point that many honourable members have made today, that in the spring budget, the Chancellor announced continued support for both households and businesses by extending the temporary 5p fuel duty cut and cancelling also the planned inflation rise for 23-24. This represents a saving for all drivers across the country, amounting to £5 billion, which is about £100 per household. In addition, at spring budget, we went further by extending energy support, because we know that inflation has been a real problem for many households across the country. So we kept the energy price guarantee at £2,500 for 3 months from April, saving households an additional £160, bringing total government support for energy bills to £1,500 for a typical household since October 2022. Alongside this, we've even gone further and helped to support households by ending the premium paid by over 4 million households using prepayment meters across the United Kingdom. We've also announced, as you will have seen, Mr. Sharma, that we've introduced 30 hours of free childcare per week for working parents with children aged 9 months to 3 years in England, alongside a substantial uplift in the hourly rate that's paid to providers and through market reforms. And it's in addition to the benefits uprating and support for vulnerable households across this country that we announced at the autumn statement, which included new cost of living payments for this year and next, helping more than 8 million UK households on eligible means-tested benefits. This includes this is in addition to 8 million pension households and 6 million people across the country with disabilities on disability benefits. So taken together, Mr. Sharma, we've provided support to households to help them with higher bills worth £94 billion, or £3,300 per household on average across 22 to 23 and 23 to 24. This is one of the largest packages of support in Europe. But as the Honourable Lady for Labour pointed out, high inflation is the greatest immediate economic challenge that we face. It's why the Prime Minister set it out as one of his top priorities. And it's why we in the Treasury have set out a clear plan to reduce inflation. Now, I just want to wrap up by addressing, of course. Yeah.
Abena, open the slide.
Sure, if this is working. I want to thank the Minister for giving way and also for his generosity and his time. One of the things I wanted to ask is, given the fact that over 40,000 people have signed this petition, is the Treasury going to look into this in light of the fact that there has been a large amount of people raise this, and also give some indication as to whether some work has already been done by the scenes? Will the Minister be able to let me know if they've been lobbied for directly in terms of calls for changes to the mileage scheme? Because I know that Unison have done some work. I know some other stakeholders have done some work on this. So be keen to know if any meetings or levels of engagement have taken place. Thank you, Mr. Sharma.
Mr. Sharma, it's a very fair question. I can assure her that there's an extensive review process that takes place, taking into account a range of factors, but a big part of it is engagement. And we have engaged extensively with various industries and unions in particular as well, and will continue to do that around the fiscal event cycle as I have described. All taxes remain under review. I would just also like to update the Honourable Lady in answer to her earlier question, because I've magically received an answer to this. 1.8 to 2.1 million people use their own vehicles for business travel, and 200,000 employees claim mileage allowance relief. That's 40% of all those who are entitled to it. So I hope that addresses the question that she raised earlier. Let me just finally, I'm coming to the end of my remarks, but I want to make sure that I address as many of the points as possible. My honourable friend for Waveney made very specific points about the importance of NHS staff, and let me just put on record my thanks to all NHS workers who use their own car. We entirely agree with the emphasis that he put on the importance that they have in our society. I would stress that AMAPs is a voluntary rate. It is up to the NHS as employers to determine the rate. Travel cost reimbursement is covered by NHS terms and conditions jointly agreed between trade unions and the employers. And as my honourable friend for Darlington pointed out, as of January 2023, the NHS have increased the AMAP rate to above the AMAP rate to 59 pence for cars up to 3,500 miles, given that a number of NHS workers travel a shorter distance, and that's in recognition of that. Finally, the Honourable Lady for the Labour Party, yeah, of course.
Clarification in respect to the points that I made. I wonder if the Minister could clarify for me and for people in the Chamber as to why it is right and fair for that scheme to apply in the NHS, but not outside of it.
Well, as I said, it's a voluntary scheme. Any organisation can apply a higher rate than the AMAP rate, and in this case, the NHS has chosen to do that. And so if he believes that other organisations should be offering a higher rate, that is something that he should take up with that organisation.
I'm incredibly grateful for the Minister giving way once again. And in respect of that, if an organisation chose to take those higher rates, could the Minister outline what tax consequences there would be?
Yes. So if a rate is provided that is above the AMAP rate, then national insurance and income tax would be applied to that difference amount, depending on the personal circumstances of the individual. For example, owing to personal, the amount of overall income tax that they're paying, whether they're over the personal allowance amount. For voluntary organisations, which he spoke about, as I pointed out to my honourable friend for Waveney, Carshalton, Wallington and others, they can offer any rate that they want, so long as the evidence is shown for the journeys. They don't have to use the AMAP rate. So I hope that that clarifies for my honourable friend. Mr Sharma, in conclusion, as I've set out, is ultimately for employers to determine the expenses paid to their employees in respect to motoring costs that they incur with their private vehicles. The government sets AMAP and simplified expenses rates with an aim to create administrative simplicity. These rates will necessarily be more appropriate for some motorists than others, and the government has taken decisive action to support households with the cost of living, as I've extensively set out today. The government will continue to keep AMAP and simplified expenses under review, as with all taxes and all allowances.
Wait one last time. If I could come in right at the end. I've listened very carefully, and I thank him for his response. But would he not agree that actually, that over the last decade, there has been a societal change in the way that community transport is such a vital, important component part of our public transport system, and in the way that health and social care is delivered, if you like, people go to people's homes rather than people come into hospitals now so often, that in itself warrants a fundamental review and looking at this system.
Well, just in the nick of time, Mr. Sharma, but he makes a valid point. I'll take that in two parts. First of all, for care providers, this is a matter for the employer, as I say. It is entirely up to them, depending on changing circumstances and how care is provided, to offer a rate that they deem appropriate. And as I say, the NHS have offered a higher rate for those travelling less than 3,500 miles. But his broader point about the importance of community organisations, and he cites in particular community transportation, is a vital part of our communities, particularly in constituencies like mine in rural parts of the country. That's why this government has got behind voluntary and community organisations. As I say, we've recently announced another £100 million of support to specifically target charities and community organisations, and that support will remain just as it has for many years. So I'm very grateful, Mr. Sharma, for all the contributions and interventions that my own friends and colleagues have made across the House. It is an important debate to have, and I'm pleased to have addressed this on behalf of the government today.
Thank you, Minister. Elliot Colburn to wind up.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sharma. I promise not to detain the House till 7 p.m. I do just want to thank all honourable and right honourable members for attending today's debate, and again to the petitioners for bringing us here to discuss this important issue this afternoon. I would just like to urge the Minister to take back to Treasury the strong cross-party consensus that has been demonstrated here today in advance of the autumn statement, that we would like to see an uprating of the AMAP scheme. I think we all agree, and indeed the petitioners who I've met agreed, that the system itself isn't the problem, but the frequency in which it gets uprated clearly is. And I do take his point that this is voluntary, but just two quick things I would like to say on that. For employers, of course they do look to HMRC to set the standard, and many of them use it, and not many will be tempted to take a tax liability for going over that amount. And in terms of volunteers, again, whilst I appreciate that you could go further, the need to provide evidence seems like an unnecessary administrative burden, in my view. Much simpler would be to increase the base rate that voluntary organisations could offer. Because, of course, the general principle here is that no one using their personal car for work or for volunteering should incur or should be out of pocket for doing so. But on that basis, Mr. Sharma, I beg to move the motion.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 60966 relating to the approved mileage allowance payment rate. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned. Okay? Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.